All right, I think enough people are starting to file in. Alrighty, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. I am Taylor, I work at Slope Garden Center, and here we have a webinar about setting up your spring vegetable garden. Our speaker today is Dan Alexander, and he has a lot of information to share with you, and I hope you enjoy it. A few things to kind of go through before we start. There is, these webinars are going to be posted on our website. It is under the Learn tab where it says workshops and seminars. And you can see a bunch of listings of our future webinars coming up. I think we have one on WaterWise and a few other ones after that you can sign up for. And also this one and all of our previous ones are posted there. This will be posted this coming Tuesday with the rest up there already. So if you can come go in, watch them and kind of rehash everything that we went through. And then I also want to talk about, we have a Q&A section for this webinar. So if you have any questions throughout the whole time, kind of go in there, type them in. I'll be sifting through them, finding some of the really good questions that we can bring up with Dan. And then all the other ones, I know if there are some good specific ones or some other questions we might not get to, we definitely check those out and we look through them, and that helps us develop content for the future and see what you all are interested in and what you're asking questions about, which is really helpful. Other than that, we will be doing this about every Saturday morning, like we're doing today. We might have some more in the future as well. So let us know what works for you and what you've been enjoying and what you also want to learn about. So I'm going to pass this over to Dan, who's going to start today. And all the questions that you are going to be giving in, we might have a few during the webinar, but we'll save most for the end so you can kind of go through them and really work on what on your questions and what you're interested in. So I'll pass it over to Dan. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor. And thanks to Jen for all of her organizational work, and she is behind the camera today as well. I'm Dan Alexander, and I'm on staff here at the Slope Garden Center on Miller Avenue in Mill Valley. And among my tasks here is to curate the vegetable and herb section of the nursery. So I'm pretty intimately familiar with what is available and with the seasonality of our various crops that we all grow in our gardens around here. Today we're going to talk about planting the spring garden, and I hope I can convince you to start executing on the plan shortly as well. Living here in the Bay Area, we have this fantastic benign climate where most people in the country are still dealing with frozen ground or snow or freezing temperatures. We are past our date of last frost, which is generally considered to be about the middle of February. And we are ready to get our ground ready to plant and to actually start planting some of the earlier spring crops. I like to think of the seasons here as being really three different vegetable sections or seasons that are interconnected. The spring season, the summer season, and then the fall season, which can go right on through the winter. Many crops can be grown year-round here, and we tend to forget that sometimes, that even in the coldest part of the year here, we can grow many crops. Of course, the Bay Area is large and diverse, and anything that I say here is going to be fairly general. You have a specific microclimate that you live in, and each of us has to learn about our microclimate and how it works with various vegetable and herb crops. If you live in the western part of San Francisco, subject to the fog and the sea breezes and the sandy soil that is out there, you have a very different microclimate from central Marin or from Contra Costa County. And here's where the advantage of having a local garden center comes in, because the people in your local garden center will have the best local knowledge and be able to help you more specifically. So take whatever is said here as a general rule, and then start learning to apply it to your specific circumstances. One of the big questions is how much space do I need to plan for in a vegetable garden? And the good news is that you don't need very much. If you've got lots of space, you have no problem. If you have little space or only a deck to grow vegetables on, you can still do it. And I, for instance, have turned my garden in the ground over to my dog, so it's not compatible with vegetables, but I have deck areas that are wonderful for growing everything I need to grow. Containers are a good solution for many kinds of vegetables. And the good news there is that you can ensure good drainage, you can ensure fertility very easily, and the biggest downside is that you'll have to water more often if you're in a container. Size-wise, my own feeling is that if you can devote about a 3-foot diameter or a 4-foot square to your first vegetable garden, that's a wonderful size for getting to know how to do things, having some success with a few crops, and then moving on to more of that kind of area later on. Visualizing a garden, we probably tend to think of farms that we have seen with long rows of different things, and in the old days, a team of oxen plowing a long straight furrow, and these days a tractor. But that's not the way our gardens work at home. We don't need to think in linear terms about our gardens. We can think in area terms. And I like to adopt what Mel Bartholomew has eloquently set forth in a book called Square Foot Gardening, or this one is All New Square Foot Gardening. Mel Bartholomew, by the way, in which he helps you visualize the spaces that vegetables need. And he even advocates, and I've tried this and it works quite well for my visualizing, laying out the garden in square foot sections with strings so that it will help you plant your area well. Crops need different amounts of space depending on how they're going to be grown, how they're going to be harvested. A good example are lettuce, where if you want a head of lettuce, you have to devote about that much space to the head of lettuce. But lettuce can easily be grown so that you harvest it not as a head, but individual leaves as you grow. And in that case, the lettuces can be grown very close together. This is about 3 inches. And the lettuce will grow up instead of out, and you will pick it as it grows. You'll always have fresh leaves, and you can grow much more lettuce in a small space that way. I pick lettuce from a little farm near my home where they grow it, and their lettuce beds are just completely packed with lettuce, and there are little scissors nearby, and you clip off the leaves as you want them, and you can grow a lot of lettuce that way. Other crops will need more room, obviously. If you're going to grow a broccoli and let it head up into a nice big fat head of broccoli, you're going to need a little more than a square foot for it. But again, the square foot approach helps you visualize how much space you need. A 3-foot diameter circle has the ability to reach every bit of it with your arm easily. A 4-foot square, about the same. A 4-foot square is 16 square feet. And if you had a bed that was about a foot deep, which is about all you need for most crops, it would require enough soil to have a root depth of about a foot. And with the exception of tomatoes and potatoes, there aren't too many crops that need more than that 12 inches to grow successfully. You can even put a little raised bed on a concrete patio with no bottom on it. It'll stay in the patio, obviously, but you could do that and have a foot of soil and grow just about every crop that you want to. Fortunately, there are many varieties of vegetables to choose from. And for instance, I wouldn't try to grow a foot-long carrot in that much soil, but I would grow a 3-inch carrot. And those are readily available to you as in several varieties. And so you can adapt the crop that you grow to your situation. Now, if you're fortunate enough to have a plot of native soil of some sort, that gives you even more options, but it also gives you some challenges because your native soil can be amazingly different depending on where you're located, where the soil came from. If you think about a house being built, a great deal of soil is scraped away, the house is built, and then often some kind of topsoil from someplace is brought in to replace the soil that was taken away. Not too many builders have been smart enough to scrape off the topsoil, build the house, and put the same topsoil back in the same place. So you could have soil that came from almost anywhere, and the quality of it can be highly variable. So getting to know what your plot of ground is like is kind of important. If your soil is extremely sandy or has a high clay level in it, you have special challenges. If it's somewhere in between where it doesn't just fall apart, even if it's wet, fall apart in a sandy, gritty way, or if it doesn't squish into a wad of clay, like you used to play with as a kid, then you've got something in between, which is probably much easier to work with. If you have a sandy or heavy clay soil, the good news is you treat it the same way to improve it. And that's by adding organic matter to it. In sandy soil, organic matter acts like a sponge and absorbs water and retains nutrients. In a clay soil, the organic matter acts to break up the tiny clay particles into little bigger agglomerations so that they don't hold on to as much water and they don't squeeze all the air out when they're wet. Roots of plants, just like us, need oxygen to breathe. And although the green part of the plant uses carbon dioxide to manufacture food and gives off oxygen, the roots have to absorb oxygen. And a soil that is heavy clay and very wet will exclude oxygen, and that's why the plants have trouble in it unless they are some native plants that have adapted from the get-go to the heavy soil. So adding organic matter to any soil is helpful, but especially to heavy clay or very sandy soils. My own recipe for adding organic matter is to use a compost product, which doesn't have animal manure in it, as about 3 parts of the organic matter mix, and then an animal manure, usually steer manure or chicken manure, as about 1/4 of it. And I don't want to add too much at one time. My limit is about a 2-inch layer of organic matter mixed in with the top 10 or 12 inches of soil. Too much organic matter is not helpful to the fertility of the soil, but too little doesn't do enough to improve the texture of the soil. There are some specialty amendments like worm castings that are especially helpful for clay soils for improving the texture. And they're not so much to improve the fertility as to allow the water to drain and allow the air to mix in the soil. But worm castings are very helpful for that. Fertility of a soil has a lot to do with temperature, a lot to do with the acidity or alkalinity of the soil, and the ability of bacteria and fungi to break down the organic matter to make its products available to the plants. Soil is a living organism, if you will, full of little beasties that help with the transmission of the nutrients into the roots of the plants. So the advantage to native soil is that you'll get that rich, eventually get that rich biome in there. In containers, we don't really get that, but we can mimic it in a sense by adding some fungi and bacteria that are common elements of some of the better organic fertilizers. This is the E.B. Stone tomato and vegetable fertilizer. And if you were to read the side of it the way you read the ingredients of a food item, you would see the addition of lots of bacteria and fungi in here, which are helpful to the plants. Usually in a way, they help to extract the nutrients from the soil, and they actually attach to the plant roots in order to help the plant absorb the nutrients. So I would look for fertilizers that have those fungi and bacteria in them. Fertility is usually thought of in the sense of the macronutrients, which are the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash or potassium that are in the soil. Most organic fertilizers will be fairly balanced with the exception of a few that are designed just for one nutrient. But a fertilizer like this has about even numbers, about 4 to 5% nitrogen, 4 to 5% phosphorus, potash in it. And for vegetables, you especially want to look for calcium. A good fertilizer will have about 3% or more calcium. This is critical for things like tomatoes, most of the squash, even peppers, to avoid certain conditions that are calcium deficiencies. And if you get a little bit of fertilizer into the soil from the start, you'll avoid those problems and not have to run out and get a special calcium spray to spray on your plants in order to reverse the deficiency. Now, we're going to talk about some specific crops, but we're also going to talk about some techniques here. So I want to get one technique started, which has to do with how do I plant things like carrots that I find at the nursery in a 6-pack like this. There must be 10 or 15 carrots in each of the little 6-packs that I have here, and they're all kind of stuck together. But I have placed the entire 6-packs into a little bowl of water here. And as we go along, every once in a while, I'm going to swoosh it around, and eventually I'll take them out of here and swoosh them around some more. And by the end of the presentation, I should be able to pick out some individual carrots to plant them without breaking the little taproot, which is the carrot. I used to not recommend that people buy things like carrots and radishes in 6-packs because of the problem of breaking the roots. I don't know if you've ever seen a carrot that grows after the root is broken, but it tends to have strange branches going off in all directions. And then when you pull it out of the ground, they break off and you end up with a not very attractive carrot. Perfectly edible, but not attractive. This method that I'll show you obviates that, and you can feel free to buy all the carrots and other root crops that you want to at the nursery. They're also easy to grow from seed, and we'll talk about that as well. You really have two choices for most crops these days. One is to start with starts, and the other is to grow them from seed. Growing from seed takes a little more planning, it takes a little more labor. And I think for beginning gardeners, you are best off just to go ahead and buy some plants at the nursery and grow them up and enjoy them. Figure out which ones you're really going to eat. Figure out which ones last you through the season and which ones you have to keep replacing. And learn to grow from seed if you want to as things go along. It's not difficult. But it does take quite a bit more labor because there are steps getting the little sprouts into a little bigger container, growing them up for a little while, and then finally planting them out into their final location. And if you're like me, you've got lots of things going on, and sometimes you forget about them a little bit, and then they don't get watered, and so you lose a few here and there. But if you develop a little system, and figure out which crops are easiest for you to grow that way, it is both less expensive, and there is a huge variety of different varieties of each kind of vegetable that you can experiment with from seed that won't be available at your local nursery. Now, having said that, there are more and more and more different varieties of things available at your local nursery. I love to talk about leafy vegetables. They're not the most romantic or charismatic, probably, of all vegetables. I suppose the tomato takes that. Are we going to do a tomato presentation at some point? Okay. We won't talk too much about tomatoes then. We'll leave that. But this is the spring. It's cool. And this is the time for leafy vegetables. It's still too cold out there for the more charismatic fruits and vegetables that need quite a bit of heat and sunshine, direct sunshine, to produce fruits, which require a lot of sugars. But leafy vegetables, and in particular lettuces and things like choy and mustards, the beautiful color, like the cooler weather, spinach as well, and they can be grown virtually year-round in our climate. They probably shouldn't be planted in the dead of winter, say from middle of December to middle of January, but they can keep growing if you've already got them in. And there are tremendous numbers of lettuces being produced now by the growers, from green butter lettuces to red leaf lettuces like this. This is a beautiful green and bronze leaf lettuce here. And if you have a variety of lettuces growing in your little plot, you can make a beautiful, beautiful salad that'll be much more flavorful than with any lettuce you can buy at the grocery store, I guarantee. And of course, I like to put in a few violas to go with them, which can be grown almost year-round as well, and which are extremely tasty. Can't beat a viola. But even if you don't like to eat them, they're very pretty in a salad, and you shouldn't avoid them. They will They're not the biggest pollinator magnet, but they do help somewhat to attract pollinators. And they should always be part of your vegetable garden. Not every nursery has organic flower starts. And if you were going to eat them, I would suggest you go with the organic. If you're only doing them decoratively, I still prefer organic, but I wouldn't avoid growing them just because they're not organically grown. I don't believe that adding non-organic plants to your organic garden is going to contaminate it in any way. But it is definitely better for the earth to grow things organically. And so you're supporting the producers who are doing that and tending the land. And that's my soapbox for today. Many vegetables are available this year that were in very short supply last year. The pandemic had us scampering for supplies, as I think we know that many people were growing their gardens for the first time. And so things like strawberries just disappeared off the market and we couldn't get them anymore. This year, at least early in the season here, they're in good supply. They, by the way, are almost never organic. They're never certified organic. Organic crowns that the growers grow them for are just not available. So our suppliers who are organic growers grow them in their normal organic way, but they can't certify them as organic because the crowns themselves weren't produced that way. But again, I would not avoid strawberries because of that. And they're in plentiful supply. Peas are also a spring crop that likes the cooler weather. They're not very happy during our warmer summers, but they're happy in the spring and fall. And you want to get them in as soon as you can and grow edible potted peas or shelling peas. I have to admit, shelling peas are not as popular. People don't like to sit around the kitchen shelling peas anymore, I guess. Maybe our great-grandmothers enjoyed that, but I don't think most of us do. But edible potted peas are available both as vines that grow tall, need some support, and as bush peas that don't really need any support and don't take up as much space. Things like peas that climb and beans that climb and that you'll be putting in a little later as it gets warmer can be grown in a very small garden if you give them some support and grow them in an orientation to the sun where they're not shading out all the rest of your plants. So in other words, they should be in kind of the north side of the garden. They'll get sun, the things in front of them will get sun. And by in front, I mean facing the sun. You can put them in a window box, for instance, put them in a window box, put a few stakes and a few strings and grow the beans up the back of the window box, and then grow your other plants in front of it. That works wonderfully well. Beans are legumes, and that means that they have the ability to have little nodules on their roots where bacteria will take the nitrogen out of the air and fix it in a way that can be used by the plants and be part of their nitrogen source. So they have traditionally been grown as plants to increase the fertility of soils. And generally speaking, you want to leave the roots of beans in the ground when you're finished with the crop. With the exception of runner beans, like scarlet runner beans, the beans we eat are annual plants. They grow in the summer, and when the weather gets cold, they die. But the vines and the roots are helpful for increasing fertility, and you should, if you have a compost pile, the bean plants should go into your compost pile. Some plants like tomatoes and potatoes, you should not put into your compost pile. The reason being that they're so subject to diseases that you're likely to have the diseases reproducing in your compost pile unknowingly and then spread it to your next crop the next year that way. So I recommend that potatoes and tomatoes in particular be put in your green can and be professionally heat composted so that the well, it's mostly funguses are destroyed in the process. So right now, we'll talk about preparing your soil. And if you're preparing a new piece of ground that hasn't been gardened before, you have a little bit of work cut out for you. I have the basic tools here, which are these implements of destruction, a spade and a fork. And they have different designs and different uses. The spade is for making that first tough turn of the soil. The depth is going to be 10 to 11 inches, and it's going to go down in the soil and turn the soil over. And that's all it really has to do. Once that's done, the turning fork comes into play. Stay there. Thank you, Jen. The turning fork is a wonderful tool, but is not the first digging tool. If you try to do the first cut with the fork, you're going to end up with bent tines. It's not designed for that. But once it's been turned, the fork will turn more and break up the clods. And that's its job. And it does a wonderful job of that. But don't use it as the first implement on new ground. If you're digging in a garden that's been gardened for years, it's probably soft enough that you can just use the fork. But in new ground, not a good idea. Then, once you've kind of got the clods broken with the fork, your third implement is the metal rake, which does a wonderful job of smoothing out, getting rid of a few more clods, and even can be used to make little furrows if you want to use it that way, although that's not its main task. Once your soil has been broken up like that and smoothed out, then you want to add the organic matter. So this is going to be spreading the compost and manure mixture, and then adding a little bit of fertilizer at that time for an area that's, say, 4 feet by 4 feet. You're going to use about a cup of fertilizer sprinkled on, and then you're going to get the fork out once again and turn that in. At that point, you are ready to plant. You've got long-lasting organic fertilizer in the ground that's going to take you through at least your first crop and can be added later for additional crops as needed. The organic matter will last you through the summer into the fall. If you're going to replant in the fall with crops that are demanding, then it's a good idea to add a little more organic matter as well. Ultimately, what you're building in a garden is soil, and it is your top resource. It cannot be done instantly. One addition of organic matter is not going to make the perfect soil, but over the course of several seasons, it will get better and better. It will get more alive with organisms, both that you can see and that you can't see. We all know about earthworms, and they're helpful for digesting matter and for creating channels for air and water to pass in. And there are many, many insects which help in the decomposition of the organic matter and making it small enough that the fungi and bacteria can make it useful for the plant. So there is a vast system there, and all of this living activity sequesters carbon. So you are doing your part to take carbon out of the atmosphere and to sequester it in your soil. It's amazing how much is in a living system like that. And as long as you keep it going, it continues to be a place where carbon is kept and not released. Excuse me. Now, in a container, we have to go a little differently at it. It's very difficult to make a good potting soil for a container starting with your soil from the ground. It can be done, and I have done it, but I must admit, I think that it's more work than it's worth, and you never know exactly how it's going to come out. And often it ends up packing down over time and not draining well, and is not a good place for plants to live. So the answer is to buy packaged soil for your containers. And the people that make packaged soil have actually done a lot of work to engineer them so that they function well for growing things in containers. And so I have become a maybe reluctant believer that they can do a better job than I can. A good packaged soil has a number of different ingredients in it, and it's important that it have particle sizes that are range from large to tiny. There's been a lot of research on that, and so a soil that's very uniform out of the bag is not necessarily the best soil. Here, I tend to use what's called slope organic potting soil, and it's a very dark mixture of barks, composts. It's got some bat guano in it for nitrogen. And I can see, you probably can't, that there are chunks from about a 1/4 inch size down to smaller than I can see, in order that it retains a little bit of lightness over time. If the particles are all the same size, they pack down together. And in no time, you'll get a layer that is almost impenetrable by the water and certainly impenetrable for the roots of the plants. So a decent quality potting soil will be engineered so that it'll work long term, and it will have some native fertility in it from additional elements that the manufacturer has put in. Now, I always add to the potting soil a little bit of fertilizer, and I found an open bag here of EB Stone Sure Start. Sure Start is marketed as a starter fertilizer, and it's excellent for almost any use. It has lots of the fungi and bacteria in it, which is why it's called a starter fertilizer. And its numbers are 4, 6, 2. So it's heavier in phosphorus than in nitrogen or potash, which is fine. It has calcium in it at the rate of just 3%, which is my minimum. And so I add about a tablespoon of fertilizer to a 1 gallon sort of container of soil. That gets the basic fertilizer down in the soil where it'll do the most good for the roots. Now I happen to have an early tomato here, and it's called Petaluma Hill Purple, which is one of my favorites. It's a dark, medium-sized slicer. You should not plant tomatoes out in the ground at this time of year. They'll start coming into the nurseries right now, and you'll start to have more and more choices. But it's too cold. The ground is too cold, and they will not be happy. They will sit there and not grow and just be subject to attack from both insects and fungi and bacteria. And my solution for that is to plant them into 1 gallon containers for about 3 weeks. By mid-March, toward the end of March, it's warming up enough that you're safer to put them out. So I want to just show you, and this is a general, very general, this is a tomato, but almost any plant is going to be handled the same way with a particular exception, which I'll explain to you. But a plant like this in a 3.5 inch container can easily be knocked out of its container like that. And I don't know if it's visible, but there are roots out to the edge of the root ball here. And they've started to grow around the container a little bit. I don't know how visible that is. But what's important is to rough up the surface of the root ball. I like to use the label, which has a nice sharp corner on it, to just gently rough up the outside of the root ball. This prevents, it really breaks the roots is what I'm doing on the outside of the root ball. And it ensures that they can't just keep circling around the way they were. But it does another thing that's even more important, which is it increases the surface area of the outside of the root ball. By making all these little dents and ridges in it, as I'm doing, you have much more surface area that the new soil is going to be able to be integrated with the old soil in the root ball. And that is just critical for giving the plants a good head start into their new soil environment. If you don't do that, often your plant sits there and you can't figure out why it's not growing, but chances are you could just pull it out and you'd find that the roots haven't grown out into the new soil at all. They've stayed in that configuration, they keep growing around, and they don't grow out into the new soil. And so that's a technique that you want to use for everything you plant. If I'm taking a plant out of a 6-pack, I'm going to do the same thing and rough up. And I don't have to be brutal about it, but I just want to rough up the roots a little bit so that when this goes into the new soil, there's lots of little nooks and crannies here for the new soil to join in with the old soil. Now, tomatoes in particular, we want to plant a little bit deep. So these are an exception to the general rule, which says my new soil wants to be even with the old soil so that I don't pile a lot of soil on the stem of the plant. In general, that's a good rule. And with woody plants, it's an especially good rule. If you buy a lemon tree, you don't want to bury it so that the soil is around the trunk of the tree. You want the top of the soil that you bought it in to be visible. But with tomatoes, you won't be able to see this on the screen, but there are thousands of little tiny hairs on the stem of the tomato. And each of those hairs is a potential root. And if you plant a tomato a little bit deep, 2 or 3 inches, you'll get roots growing out of the stem and have a much more vigorous root system for the tomato. So I would plant it down deep, and then the soil will be about 2 inches over the original soil line. It doesn't do much good to put them deeper than that. Sometimes you'll read, oh, if you get a big lanky tomato, just plant it horizontally and stick the tip up like that. There's no science to suggest that there's an advantage plus above about where the original first leaves were that came out of the stem. So a little bit deep for tomatoes is good. There are a few other plants, potatoes are one of them, where you want to do that. But in general, keep the rule that my original soil line that I bought the plant with has to be right up at the surface so that I can see it. And that way there's no danger of burying it too deep. The downside to burying it too deep is you get what's called crown rot, which is fungus and bacteria attacking the plant at the soil line right here. And when that happens, they cut off the ability of the plant to send water and nutrients up, and it'll wilt. It'll look like it's lacking water, but in fact, it's lacking the capacity to use its vascular system to send the water up to the top of the plant. And by the time you find that, it's usually too late to do anything about it. If somebody else plants your plants in your garden, it's not a bad idea to go back and take a look at the plants. And now that you know the secret, make sure that they haven't planted them 2 or 3 inches below the soil line. And if that's been done, then they can fairly easily fix the problem by replanting them at the right level. Now, in the containers, a good question is, how big a container do I need? And the answer is not very big. I have a container here. This is a paper container. And I brought this just because they're so light and easy to carry, easy on the connective tissue. This is about a 12-inch diameter container at the top and maybe 10 inches at the bottom, something like that, and probably holds about 3 gallons of, volume. I could easily grow several lettuce plants in here. I could maybe put 3 strawberry plants around the edge and a couple of lettuce in the middle if I wanted to. I could put some kale in here. I could put 3 kale in here very easily, and they would grow up and be nice big plants. I could put a bush style tomato in here and probably grow it for about a half a season successfully. After that, it would probably lose its ability to get bigger. Tomatoes are one of the things that really benefit from more volume. But I could make a nice little garden here, and if I had 2 or 3 pots of this size, I could still, even if they were ceramic, I could move them around as needed. and I could have a nice little garden in a very small space. I could go with one bigger pot and do something similar, but the advantage to a few smaller pots is that I can aim my watering at the needs of the particular plants that are in there. For instance, my kale isn't going to need nearly as much water as my lettuce will. It's just the nature of the plant. The kale, having thicker, tougher leaves, doesn't lose water as quickly as lettuce. And if it gets a little dry, it'll plump right back up again. Whereas if lettuce gets too dry, the leaves aren't going to be edible. Things like strawberries and peas also won't need as much water. And so I could put things together in a pot that don't need quite as much water, and then other things together that need more water and more easily control their environments that way. The same is true for herbs. I didn't bring much in the way of herbs here today, but if I'm going to grow herbs that are from the sunny part of the Mediterranean that are woody, like thyme and oregano and rosemary, they don't want to be wet all the time. But other herbs like cilantro and parsley are going to want to be relatively wet. And so I would tend to grow those in different containers so that I can control the water according to their needs. It's also possible to grow quite a big container. We have a half wine barrel out growing in the yard out there, in which we have peas and choy and lettuce, and makes quite a nice garden. Plenty of volume for growing almost anything in a half wine barrel. Of course, the metal troughs, animal trough type containers are very popular now. The advantage to those is that it gets the garden up to where you don't have to bend over and crawl on the ground in order to harvest or weed or look at the plants or plant the plants. So a raised bed like that can be easier on your back, and it still requires treating it as a container. A raised bed like that really is just a container, whether it's made of wood, whether it's made of metal, whether it's open on the bottom or closed on the bottom. It's really just a container, and you should treat it that way. Use good potting soil, add fertilizer, and after a season, add manure, add compost, because those are the components of a potting soil that are going to decompose the fastest and that you need to replace. You don't need to replace the bark. You don't need to replace the sand or the sometimes they have pumice in them or some pumice-like rock. Those don't need to be replaced, but the compost and the manure components will have to be replaced after a season or so. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about planting from seed as well, because although starts are wonderful, seeds are really easy, especially larger seeds. Peas, beans, probably being the largest that you'll run into. This is a wonderful heirloom string bean called Contender. It's a bush bean, and the beans are the size of Jack and the Beanstalk's beans. Can we see those? Yeah. They're big enough to be readily visible, and they're big enough that they're not going to be rotting away, or if you were out in the ground, putting them in the ground, they would be eaten by birds. These are unlikely. But I've taken a cow pot. Cow pots are a line of pots made from cow poo, but sterilized and no odor, but a great way to get rid of the cow poo. These are pots which can be used as containers for starting seeds and then just planted right in the ground once the roots have started to come through. And when they're wet, they're easily penetrable by the roots. And planting seeds, you generally want to take the small dimension, which in this case is about 1/4 of an inch for a bean seed. It's about maybe 5/8 of an inch long and about 1/4 of an inch thick. And you want to plant them about twice the depth of that small dimension. And just for a big seed like that, just push it in. There's no magic to it. If it's a little too deep or a little too shallow, it's not going to matter. And I would start about 4 seeds in a container like this and hope they all sprout. And if only 2 of them sprout, that's fine, but it's unlikely, very likely they're all going to sprout. And if I just put this in a sunny windowsill, they should sprout within a week and start to give me some good strong little bean plants, and I'll grow them inside for about a week and then start to ease them outside so they get used to being in the sun and used to being colder in the evening. If you have a south-facing spot in your house where you could put them under the eaves, you can start to leave them out right away and they'll be safe there. It's going to be a little cold for them, but it'll warm up so fast during the day in a little pot like this that they'll be just fine. I'm going to now swish around a little bit here with my carrots. I'm going to take them out of the 6-pack, a couple of them, and let them kind of gush around in the water, and I can feel them sort of, the root balls sort of falling apart already. And that's what I want to have happen. I'm going to swish them around, and pretty soon it'll be possible to just pick out the individual plants. Here is an individual carrot plant. It has a tap root that will become the edible carrot, which I want to be careful not to break. And if I were to use my bean pot here as the example, I would just poke a hole, wrestle the carrot into the hole, keeping the white part of the root at the soil level. And there he goes. I like to tamp like that so that the air is pushed out. And that little carrot is going to grow just great. And if that were out in my permanent garden pots or raised bed or in the ground, I would put them about 2 inches apart so that they each have room to grow to full size. And that way I'm not going to waste any of them necessarily. If we were planting them in the ground from seed, carrot seeds are quite small, but they're quite easy to sprout. And usually we sprinkle them in an area or sprinkle them along in a little trench, and then they pop up and they're going to be real close together again. And you don't have the luxury of being able to separate them carefully. So you basically just have to snip them off or pinch them off at the ground level so that you have them far enough apart. You thin them out so they'll have room to grow. Now I want to show you another easy way to sprout seeds, and this is probably most useful for seeds that are smaller. So I have some shishito peppers here, one of my personal favorites. Pepper seeds are not tiny, but they're not real big, and they benefit from sprouting indoors. So I'm just going to open up the seed packet, which is in a seed packet within the seed packet. And I have here a little plastic tray and essentially a paper towel. And I'm going to sprinkle the seeds onto the paper towel. There are only a few in here. They're kind of chintzy with the shishito pepper seeds. But it's worth it because it's a wonderful pepper. So there they are on the paper towel. You probably can't see them, but trust me, they're there. And then I'm going to put just a little bit of water in with my giant watering can here. So that the paper towel will absorb the water. I'm going to fold the top over. So the seeds are inside the paper towel. The towel is getting wet. And then I have another tray that I'm going to put on as a lid, and I've poked a few holes in it just so that it can breathe a tiny bit. And I could put some little Scotch tapes on here to keep it in place. And I'm using these trays not because I recommend them specifically, but if I had a gallon-sized Ziploc bag with me, I would use that. And I would just slip the paper towel into the Ziploc bag, a little moisture, and then close the bag almost all the way, leaving maybe a ½ an inch opening. And then I would put the bag up on top of the refrigerator. And it turns out that the temperature atop the refrigerator is perfect for sprouting seeds. And then check them every other day or so to make sure they haven't started to dry out. If you left too much of an air gap, they could dry out, but they probably won't. And within about a week, they'll start to sprout. And when they've sprouted, then you can easily take them out of the paper bag or my little greenhouse here. And since they won't have very much in the way of roots yet, just pick them up and plant them into your cow pots or into some other container and let them grow for a little while until they're ready to go outside. The refrigerator method is my go-to method for tomatoes and peppers and other plants that are a little delicate and need to kind of step up from one size to the next. There are other things like beans and peas with the larger seeds you can sow right in place. You get a little head start if you do it early inside, but it's not critical. They grow so fast anyway that you can do them right in place. The other thing that's good to do in place, and this is especially great if you have children who are participating in your gardening, are radishes. I am a big fan of growing radishes because they're so quick and so satisfying and so easy. A bunch of radishes at the store just isn't the same as pulling the radishes out of the ground and washing them off a little bit and eating them fresh. They take less than 30 days from the time you put the seed in the ground to the time you pick the radish. That is real satisfaction for any gardener, and kids love to see that happen. I think beans are probably the other #1 kid-friendly plant to grow because they tend to grow very fast. You can read the story of Jack and the Beanstalk in the meantime, and you'll have beans before you know it. and the kids can pick them and eat them right off the vine. Now, there are some plants that you're going to want to grow that you can't grow yet. So I want to encourage you to think about them, think about a place for them, but be patient and get them at the right time when the weather is warmer. These include peppers and eggplant and squash. There will be lots of kinds of squash available, and they're easy to grow, but it's still too cold for them. And there's no real advantage to starting them early. They're so readily available and they grow so fast that once the conditions are right, you're going to have more squash than you know what to do with. But don't be tempted by the fact that there might be some available right now, because it's just too cold out there for the squash. Eggplant, of all the plants that you might grow, eggplant needs the most heat. And so if you are in a cool microclimate, or if you have a garden that doesn't have as much sun, you're probably not going to be growing eggplant. But if you're fortunate enough to have a warm spot, eggplant may do well for you, but you want to wait until things warm up enough for it. As I say, tomatoes, you can get some advantage by buying them relatively early. That doesn't mean you have to do it today, but they're starting to come into the nurseries, and through March and into April, you'll have the best selection and the plants will be freshest. Unlike wines, most plants don't benefit from being in a nursery a long time. They do best when they're fresh and their root systems haven't grown too much into the containers that you find them in. So I would recommend getting your tomatoes when varieties that you like are available. Transplant them into a little larger container and keep that in a warm spot, maybe next to the house to protect it at night. And let them grow for a while in that container until the roots have filled out the container. Don't be afraid after a tomato's been in the container like this for 3 weeks or so. Don't be afraid to knock it out of the can and take a look at the roots. It's not going to hurt it, and if the roots haven't filled the can yet, leave it in the can a little longer and let it continue to benefit from warming up during the day. Even in a largish container, the soil is going to stay much cooler during the day than in a small container like this, especially a black one that'll absorb heat. Early in the season, black is good. Later in the season, a lighter color is better. You can get too hot for the roots in a dark container on a hot deck or something like that. I have experienced that where my tomatoes stopped growing because they got too hot. Interestingly enough, my peppers love it, but the tomatoes are more sensitive to it. So go figure. They're related, but they're not identical. Now, things like peppers need more heat than tomatoes. Eggplant needs more heat even than peppers. And they're all members of the Solanaceae, the potato family. And to some extent, they share diseases of the potato family. And so I tend not to grow tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, or eggplants in the same container. I keep them separated. If they were in the ground, I would keep them separated a little bit, at least the best I could, because there are soil-borne diseases that they can share. The great potato famine in Ireland and Europe was basically the same blight that affects tomatoes. So again, not sharing the same soil and not putting the tops into the compost pile to be shared with the other parts of the ground later on is a good safety measure. Yeah.
Are you ready for questions?
Let me just, before we take questions, let me say just a little bit about companion planting. I think companion planting is worth researching further, and there are historic bases for companion planting that have to do with legumes and things like squash and corn. And there are many, many, many cultural, what should we say? Cultural sayings, cultural things that say, grow this with that, don't grow this with that. My own research has convinced me that you can find almost anything in the way of advice about what to grow with what. And so I think it's best to grow diverse crop and grow flowers with your crops to attract pollinators, and then to not worry too much about whether you're going to spoil one crop by growing something else. There's almost no evidence that that happens. I will pass along that my father counseled me not to grow watermelons and pumpkins together because it would result in punker melons. So I took that to heart, and I haven't produced any punker melons. But now, do we have questions, Taylor?
Yes, thank you, thank you. I just wanted to say how great this whole presentation was. You've been very thorough and going through a lot of really good information, and definitely answering some of the questions as people are asking them. You kind of hit them a little bit later. So I wanted to bring a few. I also wanted to thank you for providing the supply list and the kind of worksheet on your talk. It's something that everyone should have received in their email today, and you can print it out and even bring it to the stores or use it as a future reference. So I just really appreciate that, and got some compliments on that earlier on. And then some of the questions that I wanted to bring up, something that we talked about a little bit earlier. You were talking about peas and growing that and how they nitrogen fix into the soil. And someone had some questions about cover crop and how you can use that to apply to your soil and what that process is like, as well as I was actually wondering if you, when the peas are done, can you just add that straight to your soil as like a cover crop, or is that something that has to be composted first?
Yeah, cover crops are known as green manure, and there's a process there, which means you generally grow the crop from seed. Fava beans are a good example. They're a very common cover crop where you grow the fava bean up until the point where it starts to flower. And at that point, you cut it off and chop it up and turn the whole thing back into the soil. And the tops have a lot of nitrogen in them at that point, and the roots have started doing some of the nitrogen fixing, depending on how much of the nitrogen fixing bacteria are available to them. And the way cover crops work is they're always turned in. That's why they're called, well, I don't know if that's why they're called cover crops, but that's the process. So whether you use clover or beans, or sometimes even alfalfa is used as a cover crop. It's always turned in and then allowed to decompose for a while. That's why for a small garden, cover crops aren't maybe the most sensible way to go unless you are going to go away for a while and not be able to garden, or if you've just decided, I think my garden needs a period of refreshing. And then you could grow the cover crop and turn it in and let it decompose some in situ. Of course, the problem is every time I put fava beans in and I see them make those little flowers, I say, I want to eat some fava beans. And so I have to let them make fava beans, and then I lose some of the value of the cover crop, but you can still compost the tops and that sort of thing.
Cool, thank you. And then you were speaking earlier about some pest management and some other kind of disease management. Someone was having questions about aphids specifically, especially on their like brassicas, like their kales and their broccolis and stuff, and just maybe your process of how you maybe would deal with them and stuff like that.
Right. Well, I have sort of a hierarchy that I use with aphids. If it's very early in the season, as it is now, for instance, and the aphids are starting to come, there aren't very many natural predators out there yet. And so the goal early season is to reduce the number of aphids. You won't get rid of them completely. That's not a realistic goal. And if you did, you wouldn't have the beneficial insects around the garden to help you out any longer because there wouldn't be anything for them to eat. So the first tool is a spray of water. Wash them off, do it regularly, keep the colony small. Aphids, everybody should read about aphids because they are this marvelous insect that is born pregnant, spends its entire life giving live birth to babies on your plants, and makes a huge unmolested colony that you just have to molest. And get in there and blow them off with water, rub them off with your fingers, try to keep them from getting too massive. If that isn't working, the next step is probably an insecticidal soap. Insecticidal soap is pretty benign stuff. It will suffocate an aphid, and if you use it about once a week on a colony, it'll keep it to a decent size. And if that didn't work, then an oil spray would be the next step, but that's usually not necessary. Once the weather warms up a little bit, the natural predators will increase. It's not just the ladybugs. There are lots of critters out there that like to eat aphids. And if you can get a vibrant community of good bugs out there, they'll keep the aphids under control for you adequately. As I say, they never go away. That's just not the way the world works.
Definitely. And I really like the idea of also at the end of that talking about bringing in beneficial bugs and stuff too. That's why you're talking about companion plants and the flowers. It's a really nice kind of full ecosystem kind of approach to it.
Exactly. Exactly. You can have a full ecosystem in a relatively small space.
Yeah.
So.
And talking about the smaller spaces too, we actually have a bunch of people who we all are in the city, or a lot of us are in the city, that are growing a little bit smaller kind of gardens. And they're wondering the sizing of the pots. They were specifically asking about tomatoes because that's a very hot topic. The size of the tomato pots, and maybe you're saying starting at one size, but what's like a good max size to kind of grow in and what they need. And then compared to like maybe some of the other plants that we talked about, their sizing that might be required.
Right. Well, tomatoes, to go through an entire season, need about 2 cubic feet of volume for their roots. 2 cubic feet is the size of this, this bag of potting soil. And I have grown tomatoes in a bag of potting soil. Works. But that means you need a container probably at least this size to go through the entire season well. A smaller container will get you tomatoes, but partway through the season, the plant's going to give up on you. So you'll just have a shorter season. But figure most nurseries sell things by plants by gallon-sized containers. So a 15-gallon container is excellent for tomatoes, or say an 18-inch diameter container, something like that. For other plants, broccoli needs about a square foot, whatever that is for your container. That would be maybe a 10-inch diameter container. Peas will need about 6 inches apart. If we use a window box type of configuration, I could put 6 pea plants in here. And then if they're bush peas, I wouldn't have to support them. If they were climbing peas, I'd have to put some little bamboo stakes or something and some strings for them to hang on to. I could probably put the 6 pea plants in here and then put some lettuce in front of it. And it would be just dandy. There wouldn't be much competition there. And this is a fairly small container. So if you have the luxury of something slightly larger, you could grow some kale in it with the peas, or you could grow beans during the summer and more leafy vegetables. Lots of possibilities, and don't be afraid to crowd things a little bit. They can always be thinned out. And you'll be amazed at how you can pick as you go and keep things going even in what seems like a fairly crowded situation. Jen is our queen of crowding things into pots, and they look, they're more decorative.
They look great.
But there's something to putting your vegetables a little closer than the instructions tell you, and you'll have success.
Yeah, I definitely, utilizing the space that we have and working with what we got. And you were saying like trimming them as you go. Earlier on, you were talking about trimming the lettuce, and someone had a question. They had like arugula, but it was similar to lettuces. And on the leaves that you're trying to trim, is it mainly from the outside in, or is it the largest leaf, or just kind of like a thought process on how to trim your plants to harvest?
Right, great question. Lettuces, arugula, all grow from a little center point. Every new leaf comes out of that same center point in the stem. So you want to avoid picking that out, pinching it out. You want to pick from the outside, and yes, pick the larger leaves, the older leaves from the outside. That'll be from the bottom going up. The plant's not going to make new leaves at the bottom, generally.
Right.
All the new leaves are going to come as the stem elongates. Now, at some point in your lettuce life, you're going to notice the stem suddenly elongating faster. And
right.
That's because it wants to make a flower. And when it gets to that point, let one of them go so that you can see the flowers. It'll make a big yellow or white set of flowers, but the lettuce isn't going to be tasty any longer. It's going to get bitter. And so at that point, the lettuce goes into the compost pile and new lettuce goes in.
So when the flower, or when it starts bolting, or when it produces the flower, is at that point, is there no other way to stop that and continue the leafing process, or is it's near the end?
There's no way to stop it.
Okay.
Arugula is going to do that relatively quickly. Arugula is basically another 30-day crop. And if you love arugula, you should learn to grow it from seed. Start with some plants and then grow some seeds next to them. And then about every 2 weeks, put in some more seeds because the plants are going to be finished in 30 days. And there's nothing you can do about it. They're just going to send up a flower and they'll be done. They're basically the best description of arugula. One of our growers spends a lot of time in Italy collecting plants there, and he says it's a ditch weed. It grows in drainage ditches in Italy, and so it'll grow wherever you want it to, but it's not going to last very long.
Cool. And I know we're going a little bit longer now, so we can't do too many, but I have a few more questions. One of them was about actually when you're talking about the lettuces getting a little bit more bitter or not being as tasty when they flower. Someone actually had a question earlier. I think you were talking about radishes, maybe talking about beets, and they had a less sweet kind of crop of their root vegetables. And they were wondering, is there something that you can add to the soil to maybe increase the sweetness? Or is it like a fertilizer? Yeah.
I don't know there's any particular thing you can add to the soil to increase the sweetness. Now, I don't think of radishes as being sweet particularly, but the beets definitely are. And that's a matter of storing sugars in the root. And so it probably has to do with a combination of temperature and the amount of sunlight they get. There could be some nutrients involved, so make sure that you have balanced nutrition. But I'm not aware of anything that you can add that specifically increases sweetness. Yeah. Okay.
And then another kind of good question that I think you touched on for the most part at this point, but they're asking like shadier veggies versus warmer veggies. And I think you were talking about the ones that are later in the summer that are definitely the warmer ones, but just maybe a quick info about that.
That's a good question. I don't think I touched enough on that, but full sun is 6 hours of sun between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. That is full sun. Anything less than that is part sun. Now there are plants that require full sun for the best production. Tomatoes would be an obvious one. Leafy crops don't need as much sunlight and certainly not as much heat. And so as the weather warms up, they can actually benefit from being in more shade. So if you're in a hot part of the Bay Area, you would move lettuce and arugula and things like that and cilantro into your shadier zone. If you only have a few hours of sun, I would say stick to the leafy vegetables. You're not going to have good success with things that need to make fruit.
Good. I think we definitely have some more kind of questions, a little more specific ones. And I definitely invite anyone who has very specific questions about their gardens to come into the store, talk to us. We're working throughout the week and weekends. And a lot of our staff has some good information and products. But I just wanted to kind of touch, is there anything else that you wanted to let everyone know about, or any questions that you're wondering if I got?
No, I think we've covered things enough for today, and I want to invite everybody to keep an eye out for more specific programs if they're interested. If we do one on tomatoes or on peppers or on specific crops, we'll go into a lot more detail on varieties, sizes and shapes, all kinds of esoteric stuff that's fun. You can ponder the question of whether a tomato is a fruit or a vegetable. We'll answer that. etc. But
You
Come
don't
back.
know, but I have you scheduled for a pepper seminar in May.
I wasn't aware that I was scheduled for anything, so but I'm happy to do it. So thank you all for attending. I wish I could see you. I can't. But thanks again, and come back next Saturday for Water-Wise Gardening, which this year could be really important.
Yes.
Very true. Yes. Thank you, everyone.
Bye now.